webinar series. As I mentioned, this is the third webinar in May, and the last one before our ADR meeting is on behalf of GOHIRP and ICOHIP team. I would like to thank you very much, our invited guests, in alphabetical orders, Nick, Robert, and Sarah, for accepting to be on board today to present their views about a topic that is extremely relevant to our community, oral health inequalities. So before introducing our guests, I would like to to explain a bit about the format of this webinar. We decided, GOHIRP and ICOHIP teams to have a very interactive webinar. Basically, it will be a Q&A section. The GOHIRP team has prepared some preliminary warming up questions to all our guests. And after that, you can use the chat, and please introduce yourself, your institution, the place that you came from, and you can make your questions. Vijay is in charge of the Twitter and YouTube as well. So there are many ways to interact with our guests. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guests. As I mentioned before, we have three editors of three important journals in our field. Dr. Nicholas Jakubowski, he's a senior lecturer in oral microbiology, School of Dental Science and Bioscience Institute, Faculty of Medicine, Medical Science, Newcastle University in UK, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dental Research. Nick, thank you very much for accepting to be on board. It's our pleasure to have you here. We have also Robert Weyant. Robert is a professor and chair, Department of Dental Public Health, University of Pittsburgh School of Dental Medicine, and he's the editor of the Journal of Public Health Dentistry. And finally, we have Sarah Barker. Sarah is a professor and head the unit of Oral Health, Dentistry and Society, School of Clinical Dentistry, University of Sheffield in the UK. Sarah is the editor-in-chief of Community Dentistry and Oral Epidemiology. So before passing on our the first questions formulated by GOHIRP team, I'd like briefly to present the motivation, the reasons to have this symposium that we discussed in both teams, GOHIRP and ICOHIP. So, as you can, try to move. Well, first, as an epidemiologist, I think that I'm concerned about the definitions, about counting, about comparing. So the first thing that's important to mention is that we are talking about inequalities, but this is not a neutral term. Some people, even if you look at the International Encyclopedia of Public Health, different authors at different time points, they define differently health inequalities. For example, Braveman mentioned that why not to use the term health inequity rather than health inequalities if health inequalities are a subset of health difference that are particularly unfair. This is the main difference that an unfair are considered as inequities. If the cause of a given health inequalities are known and are due to social disadvantage or advantage, it would be appropriate to call it a health inequity. However, it may not always be possible to determine whether a given difference in health or health risk that is systematically associated with social disadvantage is unfair or unjust in itself. So that's the difference that Braveman pointed out regarding equity and inequalities. On the other hand, my colleague from the University of Adelaide, Catherine Chalteborough, mentioned that this is not a matter of semantic, but has practical consequence. Definitions can also matter insofar as they clarify or sometimes obscure key concepts such as distributive justice and the concept of equal opportunities to be health as a fundamental human right. The concept of health inequalities draw heavily from epidemiological notions, but it's not just a technical concept. It inherently reflects social values from the fields of ethics and human rights. Health inequalities, according to her, are difference in health or difference in important influence on health that are systematically associated with being socially disadvantaged. We need to pursue the evidence-based demonstrating that reducing social disadvantage and social inequalities results in less inequality and greater health and human capability. So pursuing health equity that is striving to eliminate health inequalities associated with social disadvantage means striving for equal opportunities for all social groups to be as healthy as possible and selectively focus on those groups that have fewer opportunities. So this is the different concepts, but that's at the end of the day, that's what we are going to talk about today. As an epidemiologist, I would like to count, just to give a brief overview. It's not a systematic review, very quick review that I performed this afternoon using the PubMed. If you look at the inequalities in health or inequalities in oral health in the title of publications in PubMed, you can see that inequalities in health and inequalities in oral health are majority published in the last 2 decades. As you can see here, 79% of the articles with inequalities in health in the title was published in the last 2 decades. Is the same and more relevant inequalities in oral health. 92% of the papers with the title inequalities in oral health was published in the last 2 decades. If we expand to the title in abstracts, of course, we can have more papers on board, as you can see here, but more or less inequalities in oral health is about 8% of the total of the topic inequalities in health. If you go to the journals that we are talking today, again, this is a very quick, not comprehensive research. We can see here that it's the vast majority of the papers were published in the last 2 decades as well, as you can see here. So this is the broad scenario behind the topic that we are going to discuss today with our colleagues here. Well, before starting, I would like to formulate some common questions to our 3 guests, and after that, please, if you'd like to make your questions specifically to some of our guests, one particular guest, please put your hands up and feel free to interact. So the first questions that I address to all of our guests, again, acknowledging their participation, they accepting to participate in our symposium. How do you see the current state of research on inequalities in oral health in your particular journal? Please, we can follow the introduction or the alphabetic order if you prefer. Nick, please.
That's fine by me. Thank you. Thanks very much, Marco. And it's great to be here. So yes, I'm representing the Journal of Dental Research, and just to explain, it's a very broad journal. So we cover all topics in the dental, oral, and craniofacial sciences. In terms of the research into inequalities in oral health, we still, I think, at the stage of documenting to some extent where these inequalities lie. I don't think we we necessarily have that full picture yet. And so there are publications coming through our journal, certainly using new data sets, looking at where do the inequalities actually lie. And of course, one of the big data sets that has addressed that on a global scale is the Global Burden of Diseases studies. And we've been publishing a number of those, looking at different aspects of oral health. And I think that will be very interesting to see how that develops as we enter the sort of post-COVID-19 era, because those data sets up until now have not included anything about COVID-19. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts. Those ones generally tend to document whereabouts in the world we have been publishing some articles on COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic already on things like caries, for example, childhood caries. And we also look to think about how interventions, or particularly things like policy interventions, might have affected inequalities globally. So some of these studies might be in a small population. So for example, we've published one very recently from Newcastle that was based in looking at Wales and looking at the effects over a 44-year time span of policy interventions and how that affects dental attendance and in different socioeconomic groups. And then more broadly, some studies look on a larger scale at different policy interventions across many different countries. And we've had examples, articles that have compared 23 different countries, for example, looking at the impact of policy interventions. We publish a number of observational studies looking at more sort of targeted impacts of particular pathways and how social mobility might affect tooth loss and things like this. So generally association studies. And the other thing we do at the JDR is we publish a number of editorials and consensus statements and so on that try and raise the profile of research in this area. And just picking out a couple of things that have gone on very recently in our current issue, we've got a consensus statement from the Behavioural and Epidemiologic and Health Services Research Group of the IADR, talking about the need for behavioural and social sciences in oral health research. And we've had perspectives looking at things like racism and oppression, which are very important topics. So we try to sort of raise the profile of this and generate some interest in researching this, and also setting out some of the real global challenges through commentaries. So that's the current state, I think, in the JDR.
Thanks, Nick. Very, very comprehensive explanation. Thank you very much. Bob, please, it's your turn.
Thank you, Marco, and very happy to be here as well. JPHD is sort of the opposite of JDR. It's much more narrowly focused in a much smaller journal. We're a quarterly journal, and we typically, traditionally, up until last issue, published only 80 pages per issue, and now we're at 120. So we've increased a little bit in our capacity, which has changed my thinking a little bit about, what we can select, because I have a little more real estate to deal with in the print version. So as with JDR, we are very interested in this issue of inequalities, and we tend to frame it around inequities when that's the appropriate characterization as well. Because we have public health in the title, we're a public health journal, we have a population focus to pretty much all of the things we tend to publish. Not exclusively, but that's certainly where I lean when I look at articles and consider them. Consequently, we get a lot of population-focused descriptive studies that document the kinds of things we're talking about. Again, the size of the journal makes my decision-making a little more crucial. I tend not to replicate studies that I feel are documenting something that's well established, particularly when they're in small and non-representative samples that really, pretty much you know the conclusion before you start the article by just the title. So if they're, observational research that is not particularly theory driven. I'm less interested. I really want to see something that moves the field forward a little bit. So the areas that I tend to give value to when I'm looking at inequities in research are things that have direct policy relevance, that can really improve access or lower costs or those sorts of things. Things that explain theory in a way that allows us to better understand mechanisms that underlie this. And I would congratulate Nick for recently publishing the article by Norris, Brondani, and Vittore on social capital, because that directly speaks to a mechanism that underlies. So that's the kind of thing I find great value in. And longitudinal studies, which are rare, but maybe document changes over time, would be nice. And as was sort of implied in Nick's comment, intersectionality, or things that look at the complex sort of nature of how these things interact, I think are becoming important. We don't see much of that in the oral health literature right now, but I would really welcome that kind of thing in the journal as well. So I'll just stop there. I have, things that we mentioned about this stuff later on as well, I'm sure.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we are in warming up. Thanks, Bob. Sarah?
Thanks, Marco. It's also lovely to be here. Bob's just stolen my thunder to us a little bit, because he said much of what I was just about to say in terms of what we would like. So I also did the same analysis as you did, Marco, before today, because I was interested to see how many papers in CDOE we had, which were on inequalities and inequities. And we certainly do publish a huge amount, and have done since our inception in 1974. Most of those we get papers from many parts of the world, many countries in the world on inequalities. And we obviously try to publish from across the world as well. We're very much an international journal, although there are obviously some countries that we see very few submissions from, and we would like to increase those. Many of the papers that we've published thus far, I would say, are looking, or have traditionally looked at socioeconomic inequalities within countries, and then looking at those inequalities in relation to lots of different outcomes, so dental pain, access, oral health, quality of life, oral cancers, perio disease, all sorts of outcomes. But I would say that there's certainly been a change more recently within CDOE, that we have seen far more in relation to race and ethnicity inequalities, for sure. They've been coming mainly from Brazil and America. We have also been seeing more in relation to disability and inequalities in relation to disabilities. And both of those are, of course, very welcome. We don't see that many in relation to sex-gender inequalities, although there have been some. And I think that one thing that I thought was interesting in public health, not necessarily in CDOE at this moment in time, although I have seen a couple of manuscripts submitted, was digital inequalities. And within public health, this is coming out originally through the rise in mobile technologies, but you can see in relation to COVID and the pandemic that roll forward, let's say, a year or two, we're going to say big rises, I would say, in digital inequalities in relation to health outcomes, for lots of reasons, which we may talk about. So I thought that was really interesting to see some of those. Bob, a lot of what Bob said there was the sorts of papers we get submitted. We get lots of papers describing inequalities, whatever they may be, in different groups, different populations, etc. What I call Me Too papers. So sometimes there's a change in the data set, sometimes there's a change in the population, sometimes there's a change in the variables that are being analysed, but very much descriptive types of papers. And those tend to be focused more, although that again there's been a change, on individual downstream.
Thursday morning, 26 May. That is tomorrow. That is our plan. Please take
Shall I carry on, Marco?
Yeah. Go ahead.
We've seen many of our papers are traditionally focused on individual determinants or downstream determinants. And for those on this call, and I can see that Richard Watt is here, and you'll all be familiar with our biggest cited paper in CDOE, which was by Richard Watt on victim blaming and moving from downstream to upstream. So we have, since the publication of that paper, seen more of upstream kinds of papers, which is to be very much welcomed. One of the other things that we've seen more of is discussion of intersectionality, which obviously Bob just touched on, which is fantastic. So looking at multiple intersecting vulnerabilities across gender, race, disability, and we would very much welcome more of those. And we've also seen, obviously, the rise in big data, data linkage has been a very welcome development, although we do see sometimes quite a lot of data dredging going on within manuscripts. But generally, those sorts of big data studies have been very welcome, and there's some great studies coming out of those at this moment. And of course, many of our inequality studies are based on some great first cohort data sets that you'll be familiar with, Marco. So, for example, the PLOTUS data sets or the Dunedin, and of course, we welcome those kinds of studies also. So I'll stop there because I'm sure we will, as we go through, take up some more of what we would like to be seeing more of.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. Well, the next questions that are common to you guys is that people are also concerned that sometimes this area can be considered too political, and how the editors may consider this. So the questions that are raised from our colleagues, what might make an article on this topic stand out and merit sending for peer reviews? And the question that I think that's particularly interesting for you is that, and this is particular for Nick maybe, are they different from other areas? So the question is, what are the main challenges in publish in this particular area? Nick, would you mind to start with, please?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm not sure that things are necessarily different in terms of this area. I mean, we always, at the JDR, we're looking for studies that will have an impact, a real impact on the field, whatever that may be, whether it's sort of helping oral health across the population, or whether it's developing a new technology, something that will potentially, or understanding the real biology of a system. And so we look for novelty and impact are the sort of key criteria. In terms of studies, they need to be very well designed, of course, and rigorous. And Bob mentioned the sort of theoretical framework, and we'd certainly look for studies that actually have some kind of grounding in theory and that can help the field as a whole, rather than just being a single sort of one-off niche type study. We look for novelty in terms of the approaches and the methods, and Sarah mentioned some of the big data that are out there. We've got our next special issue coming up on data-driven analytics, and we're very interested in new approaches that can help us to understand the data sets better. Having said that, some of the data sets that are out there, of course, have their own limitations. So if large comprehensive insurance data sets may have a lot of information that can be pulled together with very clever artificial intelligence or other systems to pull out real key things. But if they don't have a really robust measure of oral health within them, then it's always going to be limited what you can infer from those data sets. So we do look for studies that identify the mechanisms and the causal relationships, go beyond just basic interventions. And things that may impact policy are great. We wouldn't necessarily sit on a sort of political end of the spectrum, but we'd certainly say we're always trying to find ways to improve policy that will improve oral health. And that's really the key for us. And just one other thing that's maybe unique to the JDR, while we generally think of this topic as being something that's firmly grounded in epidemiology and public health, I think also the JDR has a lot of studies on biology and on clinical research. And I think that it's really important that we start designing these studies with translation into the relevant groups in mind. So it's all very well having some very expensive intervention that can only be accessed by the 1% of the most wealthy people in the top countries. But really, we need interventions that will be able to be rolled out to everywhere and have the biggest impact on the largest number of people. And so that's something that I think is really important, and involving the relevant stakeholders from the very outset of research can really help to drive that. So that's probably enough from me. I'll hand over.
Thanks, Nick. So it's over to you, Sarah. Now let's change a bit the order.
I would agree very much with many of the points Nick said. The first one is that I don't think there are any differences in rejection of manuscripts in this area as compared to the other areas that get submitted to CDOE. Specifically, it is really about fitting the journal's aims and scope, and then originality and innovation. So very much as Nick said there, we would be looking more, not any more studies really on description or describing where we are with inequalities, but rather the kind of mechanisms and pathways, for example. How, for example, inequalities are manifested in oral health outcomes, whatever those might be. We would be very interested in those sorts of studies. We also are very much interested in, as I mentioned earlier, moving from the downstream to the upstream. So looking at kind of more, not individual determinants, more structural, commercial determinants type of approach, and also just methodological plurality. So not just traditional epi methods, but also different types of methods that are being used maybe in public health, for example, and then being explored in an oral health context would be very much where we are going to. And just to say, we did, to celebrate our 50th anniversary of the journal, which is going to happen next year in 2023. We decided to have a special issue on oral health inequalities. And that was one of the main kind of taglines that we're using, is to move the agenda forward. So from the descriptive side to more, well, where are we going to go? We want to broaden methodologies. We want to enhance our understanding of pathways. And we want to enrich kind of conceptual and theoretical discussions in the area. So hopefully, we had a fantastic response. And I looked yesterday, just ahead of today, and we had 58 abstracts submitted, which is great. And looking through those, there's some really, really interesting abstracts. So hopefully we will get some of the types of studies that we're after in that special issue next year.
Thanks, Sarah. Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, of course, I agree with all that's been said in terms of the kinds of things we'd like to see. I'm guessing it's a feature of my personality, perhaps, but I really like to see things that shake up the order, that you know, sort of skewer commonly held beliefs that maybe don't have a lot of underlying truth to them, and bring some evidence to the fore that can, you know, maybe bring us in a new direction. I also teach evidence-based clinical practice, so I do this across the board with my. But it's something that I think, if I can publish an article that clarifies an issue where there may be some policy confusion or whatnot, and move it in a direction that I think it should go, then I find those kinds of studies to be absolutely of high value, and I look for those kind of things all the time. The things that I really, you know, sort of hang my hat on are the research that advances theory. I really like to have a theoretical basis. Theoretically, you know, a lot of papers do that simply by providing a strong rationale for the research. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a well-accepted theory. It's just, why did you do this study? Doing the study just because it hasn't been done is not enough, usually. I really like to see improvements in methodology. Our most downloaded paper was a methodology paper that was published I don't know, 7 years ago, and is still consistently the most downloaded paper on the pre-seed proceed model. Things that really speak to underlying issues that we can actually work with, like financing reform, alternative payment models, things that actually lower cost in oral health care, a concept in the US, which is not common. I've just commissioned a paper on workforce. The hot button issue in the US is dental therapists. I wanted something that would bring us up to the state of what's the best evidence in that area. That's coming soon. We have a special issue coming out in about 2 weeks on racism in oral health that has, I think, 15 articles in it. And as the field has in general in inequities research, it's expanded into beyond social determinants to commercial and political determinants. So working in that space is important as well. So all of those things are areas where I want to see more done. I welcome that. And I really think that we have sort of a wide open field right now. A lot of those areas, we have some research, but nowhere near enough, in my opinion. The last area that I really feel is important is systems dynamic modeling. We do some of this in our research at my institution, in my department, but we don't seem to see a lot of it published, certainly not in my journal. And I think it's a good way to start thinking about where interventions can make an impact. So yeah, anything that sort of moves the translational things down the translational pipeline and into effective outcomes at the policy level or wherever are very important to me. I know you're going to ask a question, I believe, about reasons for rejection. So I'll sort of stop at this point and see if we get to that next.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, definitely. So I would like to encourage our colleagues and the audience to formulate your questions, please, using the chat or put your hands up. I have 3 remaining questions formulated by the GOHIRP group that I'm going to address first to Sarah. This is another aspect that I think that as a group concerned with inequalities, one aspect that's it's not explicitly mentioned is that the language barrier. Some journals, for example, I would like to mention the Social Science and Medicine. I don't know if it's your knowledge, but they accept papers in any language. Of course, once accepted, you need to translate into English. But this is the way that they discuss it, that this is a kind of policy to, I don't know if eliminate, but at least to reduce the language barrier. This is a very serious, I'm talking as a no English speaker, and I think that I'm talking on behalf of my colleagues from different parts of the world that are not English speaker. This is a clear barrier, and this question was formulated by our group in the last meeting. So in addition to the language, the stage of career, if a junior or more senior, a country of origin. I remember that my mentor, Professor Victor, published some years ago, if there is a kind of racism or country-oriented bias by the editors, very provoking, and unfortunately the response was yes from the international researcher. I think that is interesting to explore a bit, frankly, this kind of issues in our area. What could be done? First of all, is to, if you recognize that these are common barriers, and in what could be done in your journal to reduce or to eliminate or to reduce at least this kind of barrier. Please, Sarah.
Thanks, Marco. I think they're vital points and really important points. I think in terms of the papers being submitted to CDOE, we every year look at where they are originating from in terms of countries, and we get a really widespread of manuscripts submitted from many countries around the world, many of whom obviously English won't be the first language. And we very much publish from many of those countries around the world, although I do have to say there are gaps in that. In terms of writing, I think it's really interesting what you said about social science and medicine. I didn't know that. I think that far more can be done. So, for example, a manuscript comes in and it's something that we would be interested in, so it fits our criteria, fits the scope of the journal, the aims, and it's answering a original innovative question, or there's hypotheses, and so it goes through to peer review. When we would work with that manuscript, it might take more iterations of it, it might take more work from peer reviewers, from the associate editors, from myself, but we would work on that manuscript. And that would be regardless of where it's come from or the English or whatever. And obviously the publishers, Wiley, have that service as well. So that's one thing. In terms of kind of EDI generally, it's something that my predecessor, having taken over from Murray Thompson, he had started thinking about those things and put in place lots of good stuff with the CDOE and the editorial board and our advisors. And I think that's something I've been very mindful of continuing. And one of those, not just in relation to gender, is having a great range of people on the advisory board from different countries, because I think that's really important in terms of setting the scene, role models, people can be seen, and also early career researchers. So that's something I've done since I took over nearly a year ago, is to have explicitly 2 to 3 early career researchers, both PhD and postdocs, because they come at things in a different way, and they've got different ideas, different perspectives, and they can bring those to the journal and help with some of these really important discussions, I think, because there's no point hiding them under the stone. It's best to talk about them and be as transparent as possible, I think, anyway.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much. Bob, please.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we don't have. I'd say 25% of our articles come from non-U.S. sources, and probably half of those from non-English speaking countries. So consequently, we have some, but not an overwhelming issue with language. I sort of sit in between, you know, the authors and the reviewers, and I have to make decisions on papers when I first see them. If they look like good, strong science, and I want to review them, I have to decide: do I, and perhaps the language isn't quite where it needs to be, do I send them to the reviewers and then in the revision ask the language to be addressed through, you know, maybe professional editing, or do I send it back to the authors, ask for professional editing and a resubmission, which I don't want them to take means that it will be accepted, simply that it isn't to the level where I feel the reviewers can do a credible job with it. So a lot depends on sort of my filtering of the manuscripts as they come through. But there's no reason that good science, if the authors are willing to work with a professional editor, if their language isn't where I feel it should be, then, you know, we try to go through that. Of course, there's a cost associated with that, but I think, you know, generally speaking, we haven't run into problems with that. People tend to readily go through that process if it's needed. And then there's a second cycle at the copy editing stage with the publisher where some things are addressed as well. But you know, I'm very sympathetic that you know, good science can come in any language from anywhere, and I'm happy to deal with it, and I will try as hard as I can to make it happen if I feel it's worthy of publication.
Wonderful, thank you, Bob. Nick, please.
Yeah, it's a really difficult issue. We get a lot of papers from all around the world. We do monitor actually where our submissions and also our published papers come from, where the authors come from. So we keep an eye out, and we get a lot from China and the Far East, and we publish a lot from there, but we publish from all over the world. In terms of English language, we do try to be as lenient as possible at the sort of gatekeeping stage, but the meaning does have to be clear, because if the language is too confusing, then it's very difficult to put that through peer review. And we have to be mindful as well. We are very careful also to try and choose peer reviewers from all over the world, and bearing in mind that English is not necessarily their first language as well. So it's quite challenging. And I think if we were to do something as radical as accept articles in other languages, which sounds fantastic, but the challenges then of peer review are going to be really difficult. And how do we manage this? But I agree, it's something we continually work on. Our publisher, Sage, like Wiley, has an editing service. But of course, there is a cost to that, and that in itself is a barrier. And if authors then pay to get it edited, and then the manuscript gets rejected, it's really tough. So that's our position anyway. We try as much as we can to be lenient.
Thank you very much. Let me make a question, or take the question from Louis Cohen. Thank you, Louis. Very aligned to what we discussed here. Please, have any of the journals produce an analysis of equity in authorship of submissions article accepted? I'm thinking about equity of authorship for disadvantaged communities, again, from Global South, etc. Has there been any analysis of source of research support in articles published? Who would like to take these questions from Louis?
Can I just quickly come in there? Thanks, Lars. We do at CDO, we don't publish it as such, but we do an analysis on the manuscripts that are submitted, where they come from, in terms of countries, and then we also look at that in relation to the manuscripts that are accepted and go through to being published. And it's a really interesting analysis. One, it shows you where we are not very good at getting papers from, and that's often from African countries, African continent. We see very little from there. And in terms of those that there's a mismatch between those that are submitted and accepted, yes. So we see a lot of papers from Brazil in particular. They're our biggest submitters of manuscripts, followed by China. But in terms of those that are published, we publish primarily from Brazil, Canada, the US, UK, Finland. And so there is definitely work that could be done on looking and research, looking specifically at the support for countries to actually get published, which would be very interesting to do.
Thanks, Sarah. Very interesting comments. Any other comments from
Nick? Can I just jump in? Sorry, Bob.
Sure.
Just very quickly. I mean, I completely agree. It's very difficult, and we really need research in some of these areas like Africa. You mentioned the whole continent. We get very few studies published, and where they are published, they tend to be groups that have managed to link up with researchers in other countries. And I think one of the great things about IADR and GOHIRP is that potentially it can establish those kinds of links and networks and training that's really needed in order to have people in those countries actually managing to get submissions accepted in these journals. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but it does raise one other issue that we've come across recently, because some of the papers, people are working with indigenous groups or groups in maybe difficult to reach communities. And one of the things is that those groups then need to be involved in designing the research and helping, and that's very important. But then do they get acknowledged as authors on the paper? And how does the scientific community properly acknowledge the communities that are contributing to some of the research? And I think that's another important topic. I don't have an answer for it, but it's something that I think publishers and editors need to be thinking about.
Very interesting topic, because just to see how we are on the same page. This is a comment from Richard Watt here. Thanks, Richard, for your words. But he should stress that he is particularly interested in move ahead in developing test advocacy and community engagement interventions, what you just mentioned, Nick. So this is a kind of novel angle to be explored, and perhaps Bob, you could comment something about that, please.
Right. So interventional studies that result in improvements like this are they're not rare. I get a fair amount of them, and what I stress when I do the review and when I ask for revisions is that a very local study that is perhaps lacks obvious generalizability runs into a problem of would the readership be interested in that? So what I stress with the authors is, can you make it more generalizable by giving us information like lessons learned? What kind of mistakes did you have to overcome to do this program? What were the costs associated with it? How would it scale? And sort of give them, can you create a manual that, can you help people understand how they could follow your process and duplicate your efforts in a community setting somewhere that may be somewhat different? Because it's essentially an implementation study often, or advocacy, I guess at some level could be considered an implementation. You really need to understand both the generalizable and the contextual differences that occur across different settings and be mindful of that. But our readership, we have a global readership. We have lots of levels of readers that maybe would be very interested in an article primarily because it could inform their own local decision making, and that's what I feel needs to be stressed in any article in this domain.
Thanks, Bob. Vijay, do we have any comments or questions from Twitter or other medias that we are looking at?
Hello. Oh. We've got some claps from YouTube, but no other.
Okay. All right. Good. So the last question from a GOHIRP team is related to one aspect that we have already mentioned, but I'd like that you go further. How to increase, you recognize the importance of interdisciplinarity, intersectionality approach in oral health. How to increase this research agenda in our field. Would you like to start, Sarah?
Thanks, Mark. I think that as a health psychologist working in dentistry for the last 17 years, I think this is something that is hugely important to me. And it's been one of my main things for the last 17 years is increasing interdisciplinary research and teams within oral and dental field. I think that it can be very difficult to do interdisciplinary research, and it can also be very difficult to get such research funded and published. I think it's becoming easier as the benefits of doing interdisciplinary work have been recognised. There is definitely far more grant available, I would say, income streams available. So in terms of interdisciplinary and publishing, I think it's really important to, one, have a great interdisciplinary team. So you have to have a team to do that work, and by which I mean not just there as checkboxes. So often, for example, I'm included on a grant because I can be the behavioural person, or we get a statistician who can do the stats. So there's that checkboxing, but really what we need is interdisciplinary teams that are actually meaningful, such that they're actually working discipline, knowledge, methods, etc., are coming together and working on the problem at hand. And I really do believe that a lot of the kind of increases in knowledge and improvements in understanding come from those working at those disciplinary boundaries, for sure. And just coming back to something that Nick said about biological pathways, I totally agree. We've seen within public health, not dental public health, discussion of social epigenetics, for example, which I think is really, really interesting, talking about the pathways by which the environment gets under the skin. Well, I think that would be really interesting to have those discussions in oral health, talking about how the environment, how inequalities get into the mouth is a great thing. You'd have to start looking at biological mechanisms and pathways. So to do that, you have to get those people who have all those skills on board, don't you? You can't just do it from one discipline. So I think getting great interdisciplinary teams together is the first place to start. But I also think, again, back to basics, is sometimes I've noticed within dentistry, since I've worked in the field, is that there's a tendency to only read within the dental literature. Well, I think there's some great debates that happen in public health literature, within social science literatures, within economic literatures, within politics and political science, which are also really, really relevant to oral health and oral health inequalities. But sometimes dental authors tend to be a little bit too restrictive. But I think if we want to push that interdisciplinary agenda, it's kind of reading in a broader sense too. They're just very back to basic ideas. I'm sure there's more specific ones we could talk about, but I will leave Bob and Nick to talk about those.
Thanks, Sarah. Bob?
Well, Sarah's comments were spot on. I don't have much to add there. I mean, we don't have strong levers as editors in creating research, so we're left to deal with what people submit. We can perhaps editorialize around the need for certain areas of research in our own journals. But yeah, I would love to see more of that type of research. It's unfortunate that that we're left to wait for it to arrive at our doorstep. So that's about all I have to say.
Yeah, I think Sarah's given a comprehensive answer. I mean, I think in terms of intersectionality, it's really important that people who with interest in this area co-create and co-design some of the research. And although we're right at the end, as Bob says, of the process as editors in accepting the papers, hopefully if these kinds of studies where people have adapted novel methods, maybe brought mixed methods, interdisciplinary teams together, then if the studies are done well, then they will start to get published, and that's when hopefully there'll be a feedback loop, and we'll be able to keep this going.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks. Look, we have some minutes already. We have some questions from our colleagues in the audience. Richard asking, please, who would like to take this question? Are you doing enough to monitor interventions generated oral health inequalities? Would you like to take this question from Richard?
I'll just I'll make a comment. It comes back to a comment right at the beginning, and I talked about Richard's paper from 2007, victim blaming to upstream actions. And within that paper, which I wholly recommend to everybody working in the field, is a wonderful table of local and national kind of upstream interventions, sort of ideas for. And even in the last 15 years since that paper was published, there's obviously been lots more interventions happening, examples of some of those ones from that table. But it would be absolutely fantastic, I think, in terms of knowing where we are and where from and where to next, is to actually have a review of just those interventions that have been happening in oral health at the national level, to see, one, whether they actually have been effective, and in what context, what settings. And I think that would be a huge way of understanding what needs to come next in a way. But as far as I know, that hasn't been done as of yet.
Thanks, Sarah. Sarah Raskin made a question, would like to take. What, if any, are journals' roles, responsibilities, opportunities to stoke funder support for scholars to produce needed evidence, advanced theory, etc.? Would like to attempt to address Sarah's question?
I will just make a comment that my journal, as with Nick, have sponsorships behind them from organizations that have an advocacy role. And I could see where they could function in that capacity to encourage particular areas of research. I know certainly my organization does that all the time, the American Association of Public Health Dentistry. So, you know, that is one mechanism. I'm sure there's others.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
think I totally agree with that. And IADR and AADOCR are very involved with the JDR, and we get a lot of feedback. So it gives an opportunity for me as editor to feed back to the association where the research is going. So in that way, we can see not just the papers that are published, but the submissions. We're obviously confidential, the specific submissions, but we can see the research field and feed that back. And then those organizations, I think, are very powerful as advocacy groups.
Thanks, Nick. So given the time, I have two final questions to you guys. The first one is from Diego Falcone. How can one become more involved in editing process of these journals? So very interesting questions.
Can I say,
Sarah?
Yeah, I think Diego, not so much editing, but certainly peer review to start with. So that's the best place to start if you are an early career researcher, is to get involved in peer reviewing for the journal, the main journal in your field. If you're new to peer review, maybe getting together with a more senior academic to start with, to say the first 1 or 2 reviews to get a feel for what you should be doing. And there's lots and lots of peer review advice, either through academic publishers' websites or in the literature. And do that. I certainly learned a huge amount from peer reviewing as I've gone through my career, reviewing for different journals. It's been invaluable. And then from that, obviously, it may be that you get invited or find yourself on the editorial or advisory board. And so that's the way to go about that, I would say.
Thanks, Sarah. Finally, actually is a comment and a question for Locke. I think that's quite relevant, and this is particularly relevant in more recently, the dogma that intervention or a clinical trial is the gold standard of studies or epidemiological studies is not longer true, particularly in public health arena. So, but according to Locke, and I agree, most research inequalities in that field are observational research. And some editors and many journals do not want to see observational research because they may consider as a kind of inferior, methodology. That again, this is for a new webinar, just to talk about causal inference and so on. But the issue is that there is still a paradigm or a dogma that intervention or clinical trials are superior to observational studies. And so I would like to finalize. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer their questions, but I think that you highlighted the importance of combining theory, good theory, with good data, empirical data, theoretical data, so on. And so who would like to comment about this particular question raised by Locke?
I can say quickly, I mean, we certainly don't rule out observational research, and studies that are new and important and have high impact will be considered for sure. There are a lot of data sets out there and a lot of people nowadays analyzing those data sets. And Sarah mentioned sort of dangers of data dredging. We get a lot of submissions, so obviously we have to be quite selective and we look for really the best ones, but I wouldn't say we rule out observational research by any means.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would just say, Marco, just agreeing with Nate, we wouldn't rule out obviously there's another debate. We have this debate at CGOE a lot in terms of observational research and causal inferences from such research. I think obviously we do publish quite a bit of that kind of work, and also complexity. Obviously, I have a great interest in system science and complexity, and that's certainly something that we have been seeing more of in terms of this specifically. So you may remember at the a pre-symposium at IADR, which should have happened in Washington and didn't happen, which was the big social and behavioral sciences one, that the papers from that are going to be published, meant to be the end of this year, in CDOE. And one of the themes within that, our methodological theme, actually has quite a lot of discussion of these sorts of issues. So causal inference from observational research being one, and complexity science. So hopefully Locke will read that with interest.
I would just add, there's certainly lots of ways to manage bias inherent in observational studies. And, you know, if it's done well, that's good. And I would also argue for a Bayesian approach to doing any kind of causal thinking, and observational studies can certainly improve the likelihood of any causal argument. So I don't have any problem with that.
Good to see. Well, we are coming to the end. According to our colleagues here, I think that we need to keep going this discussion. Jane just suggests that it's a good topic for future IADR symposium. I was thinking, I know that this is an extra work, but I was discussing today the need of kind of mentorship in that area for young researchers. And this is should be a focus on a concerted effort by you as important editors in our field. I think that this is a work to be done for a group of people, include of course yourself. Perhaps we can use this or video or records to make a commentary, to expand, to go beyond the audience of this afternoon, morning, night. I think that the echo of this webinar was fantastic. People are very happy, and unfortunately, 1 hour was so quick. You know, I think that people would like more. I think that's important. Jenny just commented that Jenny is the next president of GOHIRP. Great discussion, ideas regarding a symposium and mentorship. I think that we need to keep going. I think that this is not the end, but the beginning of perhaps the process to get involved in that discussion to reduce the existing inequalities in oral health, but also in science, in publications across gender, race, country of origin and language. So on behalf of GOHIRP and ICOHIP, I'd like to thank you, Sarah, Nick, and Bob very much for attending this session. I think it was amazing to have you. And please, you have 1 minute each for your goodbye. Thank you so much. Sarah.
I am just going to say thank you so much for everybody coming. In terms of where next, I was thinking actually, Marco, wouldn't it be great to have a depository somewhere on key readings in relation to conceptual, methodological, analytic approaches for oral health inequalities? So that's where I'm going to leave it.
Thanks, Sarah. Bob.
Thank you all. Very much appreciate your moderation, Marco, and being on the panel with the others. This was a great session. And I particularly like Jane's comment to maybe consider moving this into a symposium format for the meeting coming up. So, but yes, anything we can do to advance this research agenda is I'm very happy to support that.
Thanks, Bob. Nick?
Yeah, and again, thank you so much for organizing this. I think it's been a great session and lots of interesting ideas and thoughts. I hope, I noticed there's still a huge commentary going down the chat. Hopefully some of that can be captured, and if there's others on social media, hopefully that can be captured and maybe we can feed it in. I'd be all for the idea of further discussion or commentary or symposium on this. And I think if we can bring some of those ideas and think about them, that'll be great. But thanks everyone for being so engaged and for coming along to this.
Thank you everybody. Thank you, and see you. I think that next time in IADR. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much.